All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Nate Green, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Houston Journal of International Law. I'd like to welcome you all to the 2022 Skelton Lecture Series. We've been hosting this lecture series with Professor James Skelton for almost 20 years, and we'd like to thank Professor Skelton for putting on this event every year. Professor Skelton has been a longtime supporter of the journal and is also a passionate supporter of international human rights. The lecture series provides an opportunity for speakers to address a wide berth of international human rights issues, and we're very excited to have Professor Morales provide context for immigration law and how it plays into migration crises around the globe. So with that, I'll pass it over to Brian to introduce Professor Morales.
Professor Daniel Morales is a scholar and theorist of immigration law, and his research addresses the legal problems that arise because immigration law acts on non-citizens, yet is made by and for the citizenry. Professor Morales began his academic career as a William H. Hastie Fellow at the University of Wisconsin Law School, and subsequently clerked for both the Honorable R. Guy Cole Jr. for the United States Courts of Appeal for the Sixth Circuit, and the Honorable Joan B. Gottschall of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. His scholarship has appeared in leading law reviews, including the NYU Law Review, Indiana Law Journal, and Wake Forest Law Review. Professor Morales joins the Law Center faculty from DePaul University, where he was honored with the College of Law's Excellence in Teaching Award and the university's Spirit of Inquiry Award for Research Excellence. Before we get started, if you look at the top of your screen, you should see a Q&A button, which will allow you to submit questions for Professor Morales, which he will answer during the moderated Q&A section at the end of the presentation. And with that, I will hand the floor over to Professor Daniel Morales to begin his presentation.
Professor Morales, I think you're muted.
Okay, now?
Can you hear me now?
We are using Microsoft Teams, people. It's a brave new world. In any case, so what I said was, thank you so much to Brian and Nate for the kind invitation, and Professor Skelton for his hard work with the journal and for sponsoring this series. I'm happy to be here to talk with y'all. And, you know, I really view this presentation as a kind of provocation to thought. I think one of the powerful things that legal education can do when it's done well is sort of move us out of habitual ways of thinking about problems, especially legal problems. And so I hope I do that today, even if, as I'm sure many of you will, people don't buy my thesis, which is just fine. That means you've gotten a great UH legal education. Okay, so today I want to talk about crisis. As long as there has been immigration law, immigration has been a crisis. When states and localities controlled immigration before the national government took over, the crisis was folks like poor Irish people like Joe Biden's ancestors. When, you know, those many Irish fleeing famine arrived in Boston Harbor after their long Atlantic journey in these tiny coffin ships, as they were called, and then after the requisite 40 days of quarantine, these folks looked terrible, hungry, dirty, desperately poor. On top of it all, right, the arrival of Irish Catholics in Boston Harbor was a crisis because they were Catholics, right? Between their desperate appearance and their purported fealty to the Pope in Rome, Boston Brahmins declared crisis. And they started deporting people summarily, you know, just sort of improvising a deportation system. And this is all actually pretty recent research, historical research. that's emerged. Deportation at the hands of the North Atlantic states when it came to the Irish. You know, the notion that Irish immigration in the mid-18th century was a crisis, you know, also had to do and surfaced this notion that, well, the Irish, they weren't sending their best, right? And I hope that y'all recognize that sort of talk. That's the way former President Trump talked about Mexican immigrants today. So that was kind of, you know, one early crisis in American immigration law. There was also the crisis that birthed national immigration law as we know it. In the late 19th century, Chinese immigrants landed on the West Coast. They did so legally, invited, under contract to work. It was thought that reciprocal exchange with the country of China would allow access to their ports and the quite valuable opium trade. And in exchange, the US, especially the mercantile class that was keen to develop the West, thought that they would contract for Chinese laborers to help build the railways and other infrastructure that helped the United States settle the West, meaning, of course, after they had moved Native Americans off the valuable land. So, you know, the Chinese quickly became a crisis. Why were the Chinese a crisis? Well, the mostly white ethnic immigrants, so this was kind of not old stock Americans, but immigrants who were from Europe of relatively recent vintage, they complained that, well, the Chinese worked too hard. They did terrible destabilizing things, the Chinese. They ate cheaper cuts of meat than red-blooded, presumably white American men. They didn't usually have families to support, right? They came solo. And so they could unfairly compete with male heads of households, right? White male heads of households. Additionally, the Chinese, they were just too different. Their ways, their manners, their way of speaking, everyone who mattered in politics at the time thought the Chinese were just too odd to assimilate. So the crisis got so bad in the eyes of these white ethnics, and they were so threatened by the continued presence of Chinese, that many whites banded together to drive Chinese out of their local communities, and I should say Chinese immigrants, on the West Coast in particular. Many were lynched. It's not unfair to call these sort of vigilante acts pogroms in the West. And though I had labeled them vigilante acts, many of these acts of violence to drive Chinese out of cities and towns along the West Coast, often, you know, these actions had the explicit or tacit support of local, state, and even national authorities. So to stop ultimately this crisis, how did this crisis resolve? And that's one of the things we're going to talk about with crisis, right? There's supposed to be kind of a beginning, middle, and end to a crisis. Well, the Chinese crisis was, and the local reaction to it was resolved by having Congress reward the vigilantes, right? And so Chinese nationals and really Asians of any nationality were barred from migrating to the United States. Until the 1950s, they were also barred from naturalizing. And so, you know, the solution to crisis in this case was to wholesale bar more immigration from this group, you know, for the foreseeable future and for many, many decades. You know, these actions by Congress were challenged for obvious reasons. By that point, we'd fought a civil war and the Reconstruction Amendments were on the books. Nonetheless, the Supreme Court signed off on the whole solution to the crisis, effectively saying that the Constitution had very little and nothing in particular to say about excluding the Chinese from the United States based on their race. Okay. Our next immigration crisis in the United States came in the 1910s and 20s. Now the crisis was not Chinese and it wasn't the Irish, it was what we might call, or sociologists sometimes refer to, as white ethnics and Jews, right? Interestingly, this was the same group of white ethnics, Poles, Slavs, Italians, Greeks, that were earlier rewarded with legislation in the West for driving Chinese out of California. But now people had soured on these white ethnics. There were just too many of them, quote unquote. They congregated in eastern cities. There were concerns about crime and criminality. And, on top of it all, new scientific evidence emerged by some old line wasps at Columbia University that definitively showed that, well, Italians and Greeks and Jews, they just had low IQ, and there's nothing we can do about it, just the way God made them. And so then the crisis was, well, if we keep letting these dummies in, then our population will just get dumber and dumber. And we're just coming from so many of the quote unquote bad parts of Europe, and it just had to stop. And so it did. Congress passed the Quota Acts. And the Quota Acts really inaugurated the modern way of regulating immigration, which is by putting numerical limitations on the number of people and visas that the United States issues. And one of the interesting things for folks to know about the way the Quota Acts worked is they had this explicitly kind of racialized logic to them, although this time, I think, interestingly, or perhaps revealingly, among whites themselves or European whites. And so the idea was the Quota Acts increased quotas from what was known then as sort of old American stock, right? Northern European stock. So English, Scotch, German, Scandinavian, we'll let plenty of them in. Okay. We want to get back to that sort of cultural sensibility and that sort of, frankly, bloodline, right? But these Southern Europeans, we now have this definitive evidence out from Columbia University, saying that they're just not as good, they're just not as smart, and well, we just don't want to dumb down our country, right? That's the way people talk to them. Now, of course, a more contemporary example is the way that Latino immigrants have been treated over the years. And this is, an older story. It's a complicated story that involves both, in Texas history, of course, is one of war and conquest, as well as, more classic tropes of inferiority and racial and linguistic difference. When it came to Mexicans in particular, the United States liked their labor, but we didn't like their ways, right? We treated them badly. And we had numerous instances of repatriation, lynching, violence, organized vigilante violence against Mexicans. And I hope you see here the way in which immigration law was historically, and the crises, right? These were all forms of crisis, right? The crises were used to hold on to a kind of hierarchical vision of American racial belonging, right? So that's kind of a little potted history of America's set of immigration crises. There are more, but these are the highlights. Okay. So one of the points I'm trying to make with this lengthy introduction to my thesis is that, all these crises made the American population what it is today. And I think the country that we all love so dearly and, more closer to home, the Houston that we're rightly proud of, its population, its power, its glory, it's not made up of those white Anglo-Saxon Protestants of the old American stock. They're still around. They're nice people. My wife's one of them. My father-in-law is one of them. But America today, right, and a lot of its vibrancy comes from this motley crew of riffraff that we once excluded, lynched, drove out, or made disposable, and in many ways continue to do so. So I don't want to paint a history that isn't still present, because part of the thesis here of this presentation is that, this tendency towards crisis and racialization is in fact an inherent feature of immigration law, not an aberration. So here we have it, right? The arrival of all these people from less favored European countries, Asia, Latin America, was always met with these cries of crisis. On the other hand, all these quote unquote crises produced the America we have today. And, America's got problems, right? America's got problems, but I think it's pretty undeniable that those groups kind of worked out, right? They assimilated, they added richness to our culture, and they contributed to our intellectual, moral, social, and legal development. So I guess the question I want to raise, which is a bit provocative, was like, are any of these crises that we put forward with respect to immigration really real? And if we think they weren't, what made them seem like crises at the time? I also want to make a point about immigration crises today. My thesis is that immigration is almost never an actual material crisis, although Ukraine, I think, is one of the rare exceptions in terms of at least its genesis. But the way migration is received is usually not an actual crisis, right? It's not a threat to the values, certainly of the United States, or our way of life, or our economy. And yet the rhetoric of crisis is pervasive. I want to suggest that immigration law itself creates the specter of crisis that haunts immigration politics, not the other way around. In other words, immigration law is not a reaction to genuine crisis, but in fact productive of crisis in various ways, right? So I want to suggest that if instead of spending so much time and energy keeping people out or kicking them out, immigration law just facilitated migration, instead of making visas, artificially scarce, immigration law would not look like a crisis today. So to put the thesis succinctly, the crisis of immigration today is immigration law itself. Now, if Nate could, oh, good, the slides are up, great. So now I want to show you some visuals of some crises. And I'm going to focus today on America and Europe, or the United States and Europe. But you could easily translate this to Australia, to a lesser extent New Zealand, because New Zealand is really off on its own and difficult to reach, but other largely wealthy countries of migration. So here's a photo of Eritrean migrants. There are 500 in this hold, migrating from Africa, seeking to migrate outside the law. Well, seeking asylum in most cases, but not with the express invitation of Europe. That's how human rights work. You're supposed to be able to just assert your asylum claim. But in any case, you know, this is the manner in which folks get to the coast of Europe. Next slide, please. Here you can see a migrant who's died en route to Europe. This, you know, evocative and, you know, distressing and sad kind of lone body in the Mediterranean Sea. And, you know, the journey from the Mediterranean to the African continent, or from the African continent through the Mediterranean to Europe, is dangerous, and there is a high risk of death. An effort across the world by a nonprofit organization, the Missing Migrant Project, counts 23,688 people who likely died en route from Africa to Europe via the Mediterranean. Next slide. Here, a brother of a man who died on this boat headed towards Europe mourns the loss of his brother who died at sea. All right, next slide. All right, let's hold off on that one. Can you go back to the European slide? Maybe not that one, because I think that's probably not fair to people. Yeah, that one's great. Okay, thank you. So I want to sit a little bit with kind of the sobering, you know, visuals we saw there, right? So, you know, we saw two dead migrants. They're representative of about 24,000 who've died in similar ways. And, you know, these deaths have become routine, persistent, and kind of a sustained feature of European, you know, life when it comes to immigration. And, you know, the fact that migrants continue embarking on these dangerous journeys has, you know, received the label of crisis. And so now you have some picture of the shape of that crisis, right? So I want to now kind of ask the question, right? So I've shown you a contemporary crisis of migration. And I want to ask, right, is this different than the crises of the past, right? The crises of Irish, Italians, Jews, Chinese, Greeks, Poles, Slavs, etc. So I want to ask what we mean when we say crisis, right? I think when we call something a crisis, it implies a temporary state, not a kind of fixed feature of a particular, you know, area that persists indefinitely, right? Crisis implies kind of a pre-crisis, a crisis, and a post-crisis. So one way of thinking about what happens in the Mediterranean and why it is or isn't a crisis, I think we might want to reflect on, right? Crises, we usually talk about easing them. We talk about end states, and we talk about, you know, what we would need to do to, quote unquote, get past the crisis, right? Going back to Ukraine, right? Our focus is the war is the crisis, right? The movement of people is the crisis that resulted from the war, and the solution, right, is to end the war and reach some sort of resolution. That tends to be how I think our brains think about crisis. So when we look at what's happening in the Mediterranean as we speak, we want to ask, right, what does the end state look like? Like, what would stop the crisis, right? So, you know, I think it's clear that Europeans have one vision of this, right? European leaders simply want the embarkations by boat from Africa to Europe to stop, right? If somehow through force or draconian penalties for entering Europe to seek asylum, or I don't know, armed European guards forcibly preventing embarkations from Africa, you know, maybe Europe could get there. But I think then when we think about that quote unquote solution or end state to the crisis, no more dead bodies in the Mediterranean, no more continued embarkation, fewer migrants overall to Europe, right? I think we need to ask ourselves, is that a true resolution of the crisis, right? Is that like Ukraine reaching a mutually agreeable settlement with Europe in this, with Russia in this posture, right? And I think there's a perspective there, right? I think Europeans would be satisfied with that resolution. But if the boats don't come, is the crisis really over, right? And I think the reason Europe thinks that the crisis is over when the boats stop coming is that the boats are a real irritant to Europe in a way that might not be readily accessible to you, right? They're an irritant spiritually and emotionally and psychologically for Europe because the bodies in the Mediterranean and the boats force Europeans to confront more closely and more viscerally than perhaps they'd like the reality of what's often referred to as fortress Europe, sort of the analog to the United States with its militarized southern border. And, Europeans like to think of themselves as stewards of human rights. And Fortress Europe is, I think, a pretty significant cause of these migrations and these deaths. And so, these deaths end up constantly provoking a cognitive dissonance between Europeans' sort of idealized view of themselves as human rights advocates, free thinkers, people of the Enlightenment, right? And then have to confront the costs of Europe's own policies, which take the form of these bodies floating in the ocean. And so when the boats stop at whatever cost, right, the crisis of identity for Europeans stops too, out of sight, out of mind. But now I want to switch perspectives and think about the crisis from the point of view of the migrant who has the temerity and perhaps the audacity, and I mean that in a positive way, to get on the boat. And I think for that group, stopping the boats is almost certainly not a solution to the crisis. Because I think for the migrants, the crisis was never the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean was just the available means of relieving their crisis, right? The Mediterranean was the path to freedom or safety or just something a little bit better than where they came from. I think the crisis for Africans or Syrians or anyone else seeking entry by boat is, right, war, famine, governments that don't deliver for their people, or, more generically, just the sort of bare, stunted horizons of opportunity, which most people born in places, with less wealth and less infrastructure and less power and possibility than the places we were born, or live today, are used to getting, right? Most of us in this room would have trouble imagining what it might be like to be born in a place where even the brightest, most talented child would have an infinitesimally small chance of exercising their talents to the furthest potential. Whatever America or Europe's flaws, and there are many, including their way of managing these crises, children born, where I was born in Washington, D.C., and a few other developed economies around the world, get to play out their potential to a degree. It's not perfect, and please don't let me suggest that I am valorizing the perfection of these places, but it remains true that the ability that I've enjoyed to exercise the full scope of my possibilities is just not true in most of the world. And so when we think about these boats from the perspective of the migrants who are migrating, right? And for those who aren't in exigent sort of forced migration circumstances, say by war or famine, when you talk to people, I've shown classes videos of some of these interviews with migrants on these boats, and they have dreams of becoming engineers and getting educations that they're denied in their countries of origin. That's not a human rights protected reason, but to me, it ought to be. And it's a compelling reason to move, certainly. And the lack of such opportunities in the places where they're born, certainly to me, strikes me as a limitation on human possibility that we ought to rectify if we can. And so for these migrants, right, the Mediterranean is their means of getting that shot at life. Getting that shot at making something of themselves, or not, if not for themselves, for their children. If not that, then to secure access to basic goods like shelter, housing, food, electricity, heat, that Europeans and Americans tend to take for granted. So for the migrants who wish to move, sort of stopping their movement in these boats is a bigger crisis than getting on a boat. For migrants seeking entry, the crisis was always a lack of available visas and their inability to live out their lives to their full potential or stability in the countries of their birth. Okay. So what if Europe did that, right? Europe actually decided, you know what, Professor Morales, you make a good point. Never going to happen, of course. We're just going to welcome a lot more refugees, much like has happened with Ukraine or happened in Germany with Syria under Angela Merkel, right? But what if it got even bigger, where demand really worked to meet supply? So the boats disappear because the movement happens in airports with the state's authorization. Well, I mean, here we get the objection, right? Well, that's really a crisis, and that's the crisis that Fortress Europe and all these barriers were built to stop, right? And that's the crisis of too many migrants. They won't assimilate. They will end up like the Irish who landed destitute at Boston Harbor. Their progeny will, I don't know, become president. I want to suggest here, of course, with a little bit of a laugh without feedback, of course, it's hard to land jokes. But the notion here is I find this sort of fear to be relatively hollow, at least in the numbers of migrants that I think would tangibly make a difference to this migration flow. So you may think, man, I've never really thought about the problem this way. And I wonder why this issue is not really framed from that perspective very often. And I think that has something to do with the visual spectacle of these crises, the way we see them. We see boats filled to the brim with humans. We see migrants dead on the shores of European beaches. And when we see that, we have one or two different kinds of emotional reactions. I think one reaction to that sort of visual is that the deaths and bodies are unfortunate but inevitable, right? We just have to have immigration restriction, and to the extent we have it, we can't let everyone in, and we can't fix the countries people are fleeing. So this is sad but inevitable, but one way of kind of looking at these photos is to say, it's just the cost of doing business here. We have to protect our societies and kind of what's ours, so to speak. I think the other reaction that this kind of migration pathway shows or allows for is that it allows us and invites us to assign blame. And it invites us to assign blame on the immigrants themselves, right? They just should stay where they are. France or Greece or Spain or Italy, This isn't their country, and they, the migrants, should know that. They should stay put. And, this reaction, I think, washes Europeans' hands of responsibility altogether. I think another thought that probably comes to mind, if we're honest about what these pictures provoke, is that these folks are invading, they're trespassing, they're taking advantage. The darkest thoughts people might have is, we should let them drown. And indeed, some places, Italy for instance, have criminalized rescue at sea. All these thoughts that I think can get provoked by some of these images paint immigrants as wrongdoers or threatening or just as weak and sad and destitute, right? And I think something follows from these impressions and this way of doing immigration law. And that logic is that I think these kinds of spectacles of, boats and death and people, right? They actually, I think, sort of fortify the logic of the immigration system. Another reaction you can have to seeing these things is, well, good thing we have, people keeping these folks away. I'm not sure I want to have these folks as their neighbor. They seem like they're going to be a real burden on our society. We can't let those people in. And so in this way, I think these movements of people, what are often termed irregular migration of people, end up reinforcing the status quo itself, right? Okay, let's switch lenses to America and maybe move on in our slides. So here you have, this was the end of the quote unquote migrant caravan, where immigrants were tear gassed, including women and children. I believe, this was at the Tijuana border in California. Next slide, please. And then right now, these are pictures from the Texas Tribune under Biden, who's continued what was called the Remain in Mexico program. And these are encampments of migrants sort of waiting in the queue to seek asylum in the United States. All right, so now that we've seen that, so what's the nature of the crisis here in the United States? Why are there these encampments at the border? Why are there migrant caravans? Why this sudden increase in movement during the Biden presidency, right? I think the visuals are produced, like in Europe, by the artificial scarcity of visas created by immigration law itself. If every asylum applicant was simply let in to seek asylum, if every economic migrant had a visa over the last few decades available to them, there would be no caravan, there would be no crises, right? Just like in free markets, right? Problems happen when we create artificial scarcity for goods, right? So visas are sort of the classic form of artificial scarcity. I suppose our country would be more crowded if all those people in the caravan got visas slowly over time. It's, the complexion of our country would change, but it's a big, diverse country already. Would we even notice the shift? The restriction itself, I think, makes us stand up and see immigration in a particular form, right? In the form of these photos. Here again, in the United States example, one reaction we can have to these pictures is, wow, this immigration looks aggressive. It looks transgressive. So it turns humans with, I think, human potential and kind of the bravery to take control of their destinies and move. It makes them seem desperate and unworthy and untouchable. When immigration looks like migrant caravans and border encampments, I think we recoil at the humans who make up these movements, and we're glad we have those fences and that border patrol and those people, those ICE folks, to send these people away. All right, now I want to imagine a very imaginary, but I hope interesting counterfactual, a little thought experiment. Let's imagine that in fact, migrants from Africa, South America, or the Middle East, or other populations that migrate at high levels had access to secret teleportation technology, right? The Starship Enterprise has taken pity on our unenlightened civilization and given migrant groups access to this advanced technology against Federation policy, but it's fine. We'll just go with it. So let's hold what's going on now current. But instead of migrants getting on boats, or instead of migrants crossing in this way, very visually spectacular, migrants instead appear in society like Captain Kirk on Vulcan, okay? But they're smart enough to use this new technology to sort of make their movement invisible, right? They teleport to places with friendly inhabitants that will give them housing until they can get on their feet, right? Migrants, could zoom invisibly from places of destitution to sanctuary spaces in Europe and the US, and they could do this in a way that's slowly and carefully calibrated, right? They scatter around so that we don't really notice them. They slowly blend into the society, right? They're careful not to come in large numbers. And so think of it as a kind of a perfectly invisible underground railroad of migration, right? And the scheme works. Let's say they do it for 5, 6, 7 years. And, people notice something funny, like it does seem like there are more different looking people around, but they don't really have an explanation because it's all, there's very little evidence of these shifts, right? Because they're just really careful and strategic about where they put people. Anyway, but like anything, right? Finally, the scheme comes to light and goes undetected. The census shows an uptick of a significant number of people, and one teleportation goes awry and sort of the secret's out and people know what's going on. But anyway, the teleporter technology is the teleporter technology and people keep coming anyway. And the only way that Europe and the US find to rid themselves of these unlawful entrants is to deport them, right? To pull these people from their homes, raid their places of employment, rip parents from the arms of citizen children. So I want you to think a little bit about the difference that makes, right? I think our reaction to pulling people that are already established out tends to be, we do it, right? It's not like this doesn't happen in the US and plenty of people like it, right? But it does change the moral valence of what we're doing. And it does create, I think, in that scenario, this sense that we're doing harm. Our society, Europe, Americans, we're doing the harm, right? Whereas I think in the boat example and in the caravan example and in the Remain in Mexico example, it feels, even if analytically this isn't true, it feels like the immigrants themselves are doing the bad thing and the wrong thing, and they're trespassing and they're doing bad things, right? Of course, we're responsible for all of it because ultimately, right, it's the visas that are the problem, right? We haven't given them the visas. And although I have brought this hypothetical to you as a silly hypothetical, note that we actually have a technology available to us that does, in effect, the same thing the teleporter does. And that's just issue visas, right? More visas over more time, spread out, properly calibrated, do much the same thing that migrants achieve themselves with the teleporter. Properly done, we can spread the impact of migrants, we can help them blend in, integrate, etc. Maybe if we did that, immigration wouldn't always be such a crisis. All right, so I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
I do think that I have a question to kick off, but I would like to invite our participants to ask questions in the chat or the Q&A function. I know that if you're on mobile, the Q&A option might not appear, but the chat is open now. My question for you, Professor Morales, is you discuss how artificial scarcity leads to some of the crisis we experience on our end. I have a question that relates similarly to the economic principle underlying that, which is when we have artificial scarcity, are we in fact increasing the demand as well? We're kind of talking about the supply issue, but does that in any way create an aura of exclusivity that results in more desirability for immigrants?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Let me think about that for a second. So, does scarcity breed desirability? Well, I think, I'm having to go back to economic, the 5 economics courses I took in college to think about this a little bit. But thinking back, I think scarcity has that effect on demand in, I think they're called rivalrous goods. Where you can get into kind of, and I think like where there's really, really finite supply, right? I don't think that visas are a rivalrous good. I think the economics is pretty, and if I'm getting my economics wrong, please correct me. It's been a while. But I think the economists have shown that, immigration is basically a free lunch for everybody. Immigrants make a lot more money, the economy gets bigger, capital utilization goes up, and the economy grows at a faster rate than it otherwise would. The only people who really actually, interestingly, kind of actually suffer pretty consistent wage effects from higher visa levels is existing immigrants who end up competing in the same kinds of jobs and with the same level of skill set with new entrants. So that's, I think, a place. But I don't think that scarcity. I think the demand is a natural demand, and so yeah, I guess that's my answer to that. I could be wrong, but I think that covers that.
And then, I guess relatedly, is there a trend of feast and famine? So you mentioned that under the Biden administration, we're seeing increases. Did the Trump administration's higher level of restriction correlate to that in a way?
Yeah, I think, right, a lot of this is about percept. A lot of this is difficult to sort of parse and say definitively, but I can at least, I do think suggestively what you suggest is true in this way that, like all humans, we're strategic and we're sensitive to messaging and we're sensitive to perception of entry. And certainly by constantly giving this idea that we are going to treat you really badly if you try and come. Hey, I think it's, I think sometimes liberals like to say, oh, well, that has no effect, right? But I think, of course, it probably does, right? There's a separate question of whether that's moral or should we do it, right? Right? But does it have an effect? Sure. The way I know this is extraordinarily crass way of framing it, but I do think it wakes people up, pretty quickly, is like, hey, you could pass a law that said, the death penalty will apply to you if you cross unlawfully. We would get zero migration at huge human cost and moral cost, right? So, I think to some degree, it's good to push back on the incentive. Like, yes, to some degree, there's not that much you can do to mobilize incentives, right? But people are human; they do respond to them. And yes, I do think that, the bottlenecks of the Trump years contributed to more movement now, right? But of course, now Biden sort of, again, deals with the crisis that is built up with these images on mass media. And his solution is, I will be just as tough as Trump. And the cycle goes all over again, all kind of produced by a lot of these images, and the way that these images can be mobilized by anti-immigrant groups on, media, both social media, but really just mass media. I mean, it's, media is really powerful in forming what we think of as reality, particularly realities that we have little concrete kind of ability to kind of assess, right? Inflation, right? Everybody knows what the price of gas is, right? So we have an ability to say like, okay, well, I'm really mad at Joe Biden for a concrete reason. Gas prices are higher. It may not be his fault or whatever, but when we go to assess immigration, like for most voters, unless you're a recent immigrant or unless you're embedded in these communities or unless you're in a border community, which I know many Texans are, of course, you don't really know what's going on. The only way you know what reality is by the media consumption that you have. And so those pictures are really powerful because they, I think, really frame reality in a way that is, I think distortionary in the ways that I've described, but powerful nonetheless.
So related to that, we do have a question in the chat from Yumna. And the question here is, the issue of immigration is often used in dog whistle politics.
Yep.
So how do we combat this by presenting the issue in a favorable light where it gains bipartisan support? And I think this really fits in well with the kind of preface to your lecture where you're talking about the othering of even, the idea of not the right Europeans or the white ethnic theory. So how do we reframe this in a way that might bring empathy where we would otherwise breed otherism?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I think about a lot in my research, and when I think about kind of, frankly, it's a question that really motivates the work I do. And so, I have my own answers. I mean, I think one way I've been thinking about this issue recently is that we should celebrate, I think, the fact that, as much as I think we like to say people with sort of liberal politics and social values like to sort of say, this country's not woke, there's all this racial prejudice, and all these things are true. But I think we have to relativize that to history in the moment, right? So, while racial prejudice and these kinds of reactions are legion across the country, there are some really powerful spaces. And in fact, they tend to be cities like Houston that are economically powerful as well, where there's at least a working cohort of American citizens that believes in the power of diversity, right? And does affirmatively believe, that we should continue doing what we're doing. There's also, frankly, large majorities. I mean, if you ask people, as Pew Research Trust has for 30 years or 40 years, should long-term undocumented immigrants or people who came here illegally become citizens? Trump polled 70% yes. Today, 70% yes. Maybe the numbers vary. They went up during the Trump years. So there's a lot of good sense out there, actually. It's just that the way we do immigration law, and I mean, I've written a lot about this, and this is very complicated, but really disempowers the spaces that I think are further along, right? I mean, Texas, the state of Texas doesn't let us be a sanctuary city. They take that fully off the table. There's anti-sanctuary laws in Texas that won't let us have police. I think I have that right. Please correct me. I'm wrong. I'm sort of still new to Texas, so I'm getting to know. But we're not allowed to do that in Houston, even if we wanted to, right? And when I see that, I see you're actually kneecapping all this social development happened where I actually really think it's a remarkable thing that I think in this country and in other multiracial democracies, we've developed a broader capacity, I think, than maybe 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 years ago. I don't want to overstate things. It's all, halting progress. But, I mean, I don't know. I mean, would people 100 years ago walk into a UH law school classroom and be comfortable with what they saw? Would they have the capacity to tolerate the different looks and ways of being that even our students at the law school bring to the table? I don't know. Go ahead. So I hopefully that was kind of an answer. I mean, so I think empowering with legal power, right? And so I've written a lot about sort of decentralizing immigration law and, potentially letting cities, maybe states, but definitely cities, counties, and towns issue visas themselves. Because the thing is, we are all, the people who want more visas in this country and in Europe don't control the legislature at the national level, or even often the state level. And so even though we have most of the immigrants, right, where we live, and so we're basically creating these artificial floors to serve people who largely consume immigration in the media and not in real life. And I think that's a problem that I think, if solved, could help things some, at least.
Perfect. And I know we're running a bit short on time, but we have a couple of questions in the Q&A as well. So
yeah, I'm happy to stay. I mean, it's fine on my end.
So this next one says, as a first-generation immigrant whose parents migrated from El Salvador and have experienced family separation, I really appreciate your framework for this conversation. Addressing the root causes of migration has been a focus of the Biden administration recently. What role do you think U.S. foreign policy can play in stabilizing the home countries of migrants?
That's a great question. I mean, I often think that, to be honest, focusing on kind of the push factors is often the way it's termed in the literature, right? Like, why do people leave? Famine, war, bad governance. I'm not sure that we actually have the levers to manage that effectively. And there's a lot of evidence, for instance, that, I know Kamala Harris went down to Central America early in the Biden administration to basically be like, don't come, don't join up and come to the border. We're not going to let you in. And, there was this talk of like, oh, we're going to send development aid, or, oh, we're going to do this and that. Two things. One, even where it works, migration usually increases. So this is where you get a demand effect, Brian, actually, is as living standards go up, demand to immigrate actually increases. And that scientists have, economists have kind of shown. And so that's not a solution. I think the other thing is, I want to refocus our moral framework on individual people, right? Like, I feel like in many ways I'm like kind of a classical liberal when it comes to migration, in the sense that, like, I think the fundamental injustice is kind of the arbitrariness of where we're all born, right? Some of us are born into a kind of aristocracy in the United States, and I know it feels weird to call it that, but if you're born in the United States, your life looks like one thing. And if you're born, in El Salvador and you stay, perhaps, I mean, the student can certainly speak to his own experience, but I'm just trying to make an example. In the time horizon of your 4,000 weeks of life, it's a new book out. Can you believe that? We only get 4,000 weeks, people. All right, they're all precious. In your 4,000 weeks of life, it's too late for you, right? And so, I certainly want to be sensitive. I certainly think many countries and many places, they might reach their limit of where their societies will really not work very well if they have more people coming in. And there's certainly limits that have to be, there's not enough housing right now, right? The housing prices are being built up. And so there's all sorts of like legitimate limits on, or we might reach a point where we reach our legitimate ability to carry more people as a country. I don't think we're close to there yet. And so until we reach that, I feel like, or get definitive evidence that we're at that limit or close, which again, I don't think we have at our current level of migration, which by the way, was at record lows under Trump. I mean, he did crush legal migration. He crushed legal migration under the Trump administration. During, those years, we went from admitting about 1 million a year, which was our rate for many, many decades, to, I believe, down to, I could get these numbers a little off, but it was striking. It was like 50 or 100,000. I mean, so a radical limitation in legal migration. So getting back to Brian's point about demand and supply. In any case, what if we tried, hey, we're going to slowly raise visa caps to 300,000 a year, 400,000 a year, at a rate we can, and we're going to plan for it. You can do that. Nothing stops us from doing that, turning immigration into a project of kind of human infrastructure. But that's not how we think about it. We always think about it in the negative, out, restriction, burden, without any real empirical justification for thinking about that way, but images that tell that story. Images, I think, produced by the exclusionary regime itself.
Thank you. A related question, actually. So where does the first world responsibility in creating third world crisis fit here?
Oh, God. I mean, yeah, I didn't even talk about that aspect of it. I was trying to focus on
as economic imperialism, which benefited Europe, the United States, et cetera, for centuries, but left the third world countries in famine, war, and under unstable governments. So, is it valuable to attempt to fix the problems in third world countries as an answer to mass immigration?
Yeah, I mean, I think, no, I mean, I did not touch on that, but I completely agree with the questioner that that inequity, the inequity of imperialism, is absolutely foundational. So, in terms of building, maybe the way to think about, I want to be careful about talking about development because I do think it's a fraught subject. It's not my area, and I think about it some, and I have thoughts about it, but I want to try and be careful in that space. So I guess what I would say is, first of all, I think that liberal migration policies actually, in many ways, can and do sustain development. So I'm most familiar with Central America, but I think it's true of many diaspora communities that remittances of money gained in wealthy European countries flow back in extraordinarily large numbers to make capital improvements, usually private capital improvements like building houses for loved ones in their countries of origin, building, a classic sort of Mexican-American story now is I lived 30 years in the United States. I built a house in my hometown and a small business to sustain me, and my retirement is there, right? So these aren't, I think, either or. I think also, there's a lot of discussion. The other framework to view this in is often claimed as sort of quote unquote brain drain. I'm not as sympathetic to that view, I think, because I'm a kind of classical liberal in the sense that I just kind of think that like our primary obligations are to ourselves and our immediate family, and people can disagree with that, and different cultures feel differently about social obligations, and I understand and respect that. But for me personally, one way to, I think, reframe brain drain is like, look, Puerto Ricans, actually, I like using Puerto Rican. I'm Puerto Rican. So Puerto Ricans, I think, are an interesting example of like what happens when you have free, because we're all citizens, so we have free movement to the United States when we want to. Some people stay, some people go. What happens? So, I mean, look, I don't want to discount. There's a shortage of doctors in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rican doctors don't make enough. I actually have a cousin who's the only pediatric surgeon on the island. And so, I want to be sensitive to that. On the other hand, I do think that it's not like people leave their countries and forget about them. To some extent, migration itself, I think, forces America to care about countries it otherwise might not, right? It's those migrants that care most about those places. And, we have somebody in Q&A who asked about El Salvador, right? I didn't talk about El Salvador. I don't really think about El Salvador that much. I mean, I think about Central and South America as a whole. But what you're doing is endogenizing into the most powerful nation in the world, information about what's happening elsewhere. Migration does that. I don't think if we just hear about it in the newspaper, or if we don't develop people who really care deeply about it, we're just not going to care about it as much, So I don't know. That was a long-winded answer. I hope that helped.
That was great. And we do have one more question. I feel like we have touched on a few different examples, but this person asked if you could give a few more examples of post-crisis driven immigration.
Yeah, I mean, so a few more examples. I mean, I think the other thing I think about when I think about, and maybe this ties back to that question of othering or racial fear or prejudice. I think another thing I think about is kind of how do you get people to see migrants as kind of people just like us, right? And I think partly I'd like to see more programs that allow individual initiative to get their hands dirty in this way. And I'll say what I mean. In Canada, for instance, and Canada has its, I don't love Canada's system either. I mean, Canada's always like the poster child for like, oh, we're so amazing to immigrants and the US is so horrible. Well, they don't let in that many. They could let in more. So anyway, I don't mean to pick on Canada, but one thing Canada does do that I think is super interesting for like reasons that came up in this discussion is they allow what's called private sponsorship of refugees. And they allow, and we do some of that, but it's not as pervasive and it's not as, I think, kind of civil society oriented as Canada's is. So if you're Canadian, like during the Syrian refugee crisis, for example, okay, Canadians, if you get a group together and you raise about $25,000, you can get your very own Syrian family. And you are responsible, a group of you, for getting them housing, helping them find jobs, paying for their living expenses for about a year. That's a very powerful way to humanize refugees. And it's very personal. So I think that's another example of the kind of thing we could do that I think would change how people view migrants in general and help people develop the skills that I think, frankly, multiracial democracy itself requires. I mean, I think that's the other thing. I think there's this thing where we kind of separate, right now we're in a crisis. I mean, I think we're in here's a genuine crisis for you, the crisis of multiracial democracy in the United States. We have pretty definitive evidence that a lot of the Capitol insurrection voters were most driven by fear of others, fear of non-whites, fear of being eclipsed, okay? That tells me we need to develop our capacities for tolerating difference in certain areas. Immigration is part of that toolkit for developing those capacities in Americans, of living with difference, and seeing the value in it. So, I think programs like that, and I know these don't solve the world. I think the primary one is we need a lot more visas, distributed evenly, carefully, thought through. Think about, the social implications of where you're putting people, all these things. It doesn't have to be a free-for-all, but I do think that's the main lever I would point to. But I think some of these smaller things, I think, get at some of the cultural preoccupations that I think get triggered in some of these visuals of crisis, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to pass it off to Nate. I think he's going to close us out.
Okay.
Yeah. So thank you again, Professor Morales. This was very thought-provoking. It was a great conversation. Really appreciate hearing all of your thoughts on this very important issue. We'd like to also thank Professor Skelton for continuously hosting this series. We really appreciate that. And thanks everyone for coming and asking questions. It was a great conversation. And if you are interested in hearing more about this topic from Professor Morales, we will be publishing an article in our coming volume next year. So thanks again, everyone, and we hope you have a great rest of your night.
Okay, thanks everybody. I appreciate your attendance, and thank you to Professor Skelton, to Nate, and to Brian. I really appreciate it. It was a fun conversation. Great questions, guys.